Hi there, my name is Philip Ideson. I want to welcome you to the Art of Procurement podcast, the podcast that helps you, a forward-thinking procurement professional, position yourself and your team to proactively take advantage of the revolution that's taking place in procurement today. By interviewing industry trailblazers and sharing insights from our own experiences, my team and I pull back the curtain and shine a light on the strategies, tactics, and tools that procurement teams are using to elevate their impact. And today on the show, I'm joined by David Yarkin, the CEO of Procurated, a company that provides Yelp-like reviews to help public sector procurement professionals select their next suppliers. Now, prior to founding Procurated, David enjoyed a number of leading roles in government, including the CPO for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and as press secretary for the mayor of the city of Philadelphia. Now, I've followed David's work for a number of years and invited him onto the show following an article he wrote in March in the Wall Street Journal, advocating for strategic procurement. David joined me to talk not just about his journey to transform procurement in Pennsylvania, but also for some really valuable communication tips, which are relevant for both private and public sector procurement leaders that he learned firsthand as a press secretary, and then he's used throughout his career. So let's get started as I asked David if he found procurement or if procurement found him.
Procurement found me. I didn't go to university for procurement. Most of my career early on was in communications, working in government and politics. And I'd worked for a number of years for a guy named Ed Rendell, who had been the mayor of Philadelphia, and I was his press secretary in City Hall. And when he became governor, and I went to see him, and he asked me if I would join his administration. And I said, I would love to. And I said, but I really wanted to transition from a communications role into more of an operational or managerial role. And when I looked through the list of opportunities with the Commonwealth, there was one job that just really screamed my name for whatever reason. And it was the Chief Procurement Officer of the state. Yeah. And with that job, I ran a $4 billion supply chain organization. We had 17 warehouses in Harrisburg and across the state, a 17,000 vehicle fleet. And I was, rightly or wrongly, given the keys and told not to crash it, but given an opportunity to do some really interesting things at a very young age. I was 28 years old, given this responsibility, and it was a real privilege.
We're going to talk a lot about that as we go through our conversation, but you found yourself in procurement and you stayed in procurement. What are you doing today?
Right. So I was with the state for a number of years. I'm sure we'll talk about that experience a bit. I left the state first to start a consulting company, which was a great experience, and ended up selling it to a private equity firm. And then I started Procurated, which is where I am now. So Procurated is often called the Yelp for government. It's a platform that lets procurement professionals all across the country at every level of government rate and review their suppliers to help them make better and more informed decisions. And we later launched a product called Canary, which gives procurement teams the ability to see how all their vendors on contract are performing for thousands of end users every day, so they can spot problems where they could arise.
Yeah. Now, I'm probably going to go off topic and talk to you a little bit about this. I'm fascinated by the idea. I remember as a practitioner, we talk all the time about the idea of, some publicly available information that rates your suppliers that helps you kind of figure out who to bring to an RFP or, things to be aware of when you are in the sourcing process. And it never really, existed in private sector. And perhaps there's some software companies who leverage kind of intelligence amongst their community from a procurement perspective that can bring it from a private sector, but it never really existed. And, what did you find building this for public sector? And what should I say, what's the supplier's reaction to information being, whether it's publicly available or commonly available, for those who want the product, to help inform them as they're going through sourcing supplier management activities? I imagine suppliers will be a little skeptical about it.
It's interesting. Suppliers were, I would say, skeptical and potentially scared when we first introduced the idea, because if a system's working pretty well for you and you're getting a lot of contracts and revenue from it, you don't want anything to rock the cart, right? But the interesting thing was governments and procurement teams have really embraced this product. So we have 14 states now deploying Canary. Interestingly, suppliers love it every bit as much as governments, because they're always they're focused on growing their business, but they're also very focused on retaining customers. And what Canary lets them do is it lets them see the places where they may be challenged. So if I'm the head of government for Grainger, government sales for Grainger, I may have 15,000 customers. I can't see which ones are doing great or which ones are really struggling, except for looking at sales numbers, which is not really a great tool. This lets them see at a 30,000 foot level where their risks are. So they can go make sure that they're covering it better and doing a better job of partnering for the customer.
Do you think there's a reason why it's never really, why what you're doing in the public sector has never, I don't say translated over to private sector, or that's not being built in the private sector, or the specific roadblocks that might have stopped something like this in the private sector? I'm thinking at scale, you have software sites like G2 and things like that for SaaS, but you don't really have it for professional services firms, for example, or for, other kind of industries.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are some platforms that will do it for professional services, but you're right. And I don't think that, from what I've seen, is that commercial procurement teams have not yet deployed a tool like this. I don't think it's because the risks are any less. And this, I know we're going to talk a little about the difference between public sector and private sector procurement. Part of it is, there are definitely more rules in public sector. But I also think one of the main drivers in public procurement is staying off of the front page of the paper. So we've seen with DOGE, that when you start to get into the operations of government in a really significant way, it is in the front page of the paper, and it probably should be. If Johnson & Johnson decides to tinker with their procurement operations, it's probably not going to be in the Wall Street Journal.
Do you find public sector lends itself more to transparency too? There's kind of this understanding by all parties of the transaction that, that their relationship is or may become transparent, outside of the confines of a contract, and that might lend itself to a bit more openness.
Yeah, and I think it demands it. Right? If you think about, we're doing work for the District of Columbia Housing Authority. So the work that the vendors are doing for the DC Housing Authority are directly impacting citizens of Washington, D.C., who are the residents of those housing units. So whereas if you're, again, in procurement at J&J, the procurement ultimately affects human beings, right? But it largely affects your internal operations. And so I think not only does public sector procurement demand transparency, it creates some transparency because the public is literally experiencing procurement firsthand.
Now, you also talked in your background, you really started in communications before you moved into the procurement side. I think it's one of the areas where we as procurement professionals are sometimes most challenged is in storytelling and influencing and kind of going beyond the data that's in front of us. How has your experience in communications helped you on the procurement side?
I think if I had to give one recommendation to the procurement industry in general, it's put your procurement leaders and your high potential up and coming leaders through some kind of a communications class. It's so valuable. And I got to do it in a very high profile, political, fast paced environment in Philadelphia, where the City Hall press corps was literally across the hall from me, coming into my office, unannounced, unscheduled, with a microphone in my face saying, comment on this or that. It teaches you very quickly how to do sort of like that damage control communications, but more importantly, how to use the microphone as a lever to advance your objectives and your organization's objectives. And to be able to do that for the mayor of Philadelphia was really helpful, because then you can think, it's not that hard to make the jump to say, how do I do that for procurement? So when I was running procurement for Pennsylvania, and we had very significant and somewhat audacious objectives around saving money for the taxpayers, we realized quickly that the changes we were making would be met with some opposition, and we had to get out in front of it and talk about the real value of what we were doing to the citizens of the state, so that when there was pushback from some vendors or from industry groups, we were already ahead of it, communicating big picture about why what we were doing was so important to the taxpayers of the state.
Now to an outsider, communications, and you watch a press secretary at the podium, it all looks as though it's shooting from the hip. And I'm sure
Right.
that that's not the case. How much planning goes into really effective communications?
A lot. I mean, like you'd imagine, right? Like anything that you're doing that is consequential, the more time you spend preparing for it, the better it's going to go. For us, because procurement is not something that most political beat reporters are anxious to cover, they'd rather cover, some big splashy press conference with the governor or a conflict. We had to find ways to invent or to make something newsworthy. I'll give you one example. So what we did in Pennsylvania, we were one of the earlier adopters of strategic sourcing, which I know all of your listeners know a lot about, but was new to government. So we were taking the buying power of the state, and rather than letting every agency buy on their own, we centralized it within my department. Pretty standard stuff.
Yeah.
And we had a great experience with it. We were rolling out contract after contract, big gaudy savings numbers each time. And it was breaking through, but not a lot. And I realized there was an opportunity to do it. We were awarding a brand new PC contract. It was like $100 million plus contract. And we awarded it to Dell. They won the contract over, all their other competitors. And I said to the sales team at Dell, I'm not going to make this announcement until we do a press conference in the Capitol with Governor Rendell and Michael Dell. Because I knew Michael Dell, this was the height of his fame. I knew that if we brought Michael Dell to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania at a press conference, we would get the entire statewide press corps to cover it. And they hemmed and hawed. They said, maybe we'll send you a vice president. I said, no. If Michael Dell doesn't show up in Harrisburg, I'm just going to sit on this award and this contract until he can make it.
And it's going to cost you money, while you're not launching the contract.
I mean, in the meantime, HP and I think it was IBM at the time, it was before Lenovo, HP and IBM and everyone else, they'll continue to get their pieces of the legacy contract. And I said that on a Monday. By Friday, I think Michael Dell's flight was already booked. So it does show you that procurement does have real power in the market, even to do something that may seem superficial, like getting, one executive to Harrisburg. But I knew if we could do that, we could break through and get the public at large to understand what we were doing, because it was going to be on the front page of the paper.
Yeah. And you recently wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal about the work that you did at the state of Pennsylvania, long before we had DOGE. And, that's obviously in the news, bringing procurement into the news, for better or for worse, for, right now. I wonder if you could just tell me a little bit about what you shared in that article. It kind of talked about some of the things that you did in Pennsylvania to really look at efficiencies across government spending.
Yeah. The expression, what's old is new. So I had seen some reporting that, lost in all the coverage of the huge cuts that the DOGE team is making on personnel, that they were doing some really interesting things within the GSA, which is the federal government's purchasing arm. They were all the announcements about centralizing contracting within GSA and taking some of that, the procurement authority and staff away from the agencies. There are talks about driving savings by using the buying power of the government more efficiently and more regularly. And it struck me that what they were planning on doing was exactly what our team had done.
It's procurement transformation.
Right? And it's just like, we didn't have an Elon Musk, but we did have this brilliant woman, Suzanne Peck, who was loaned to us for a short period of time to lead an office of efficiency. And she was my partner in this project. So there were some really interesting parallels. In Pennsylvania, like I mentioned earlier, we went forward with a very aggressive strategic sourcing initiative. We took all the things the state bought, in the highest amounts, and we decided to centralize the contracting within my department and go down in many cases to a single supplier to really leverage our buying power. It's procurement 101. But it was very novel and new to government. The results were spectacular. So when I left state government, we had saved $140 million on a recurring basis, in many cases saving 20, 30, or 40% compared to the old pricing, just by using our buying power in a smarter way. And so I wrote about this in the piece in the journal, but I also talked about a bit of a cautionary tale. So while a lot of these contracts went off without a hitch and were really spectacular successes, there were some that were more challenging. And the one story I talked about, which if I have a minute, I'll tell you about, was around the way that we contracted for food. So nothing is more essential than food, right? And the state bought a lot of it. We had to support 20 state hospitals, 20 state prisons, 5 veterans homes, other facilities, all who depended on a food vendor to come in and bring, food that they could then prepare for their residents. We historically had a multiple award contract. We let every facility choose their own vendor, and they were generally happy with that choice and that discretion. But we were always pushing the envelope, and we went down to one vendor to support the entire state. And we put the contract in place. We saved, I think, $14 million on a recurring basis. We were very happy. Weeks went by. I didn't hear anything. And in many ways, ignorance was bliss. But the key word there is ignorance.
Mm-hmm.
Because seemingly out of nowhere, I think 8 months into the contract, I got word that the vendor we had selected, that we put all of our proverbial eggs in their basket, pardon the pun, all of a sudden announced to us they could no longer support the state and they were going to pull out of the contract, which left us in a horrible position.
Mm-hmm.
And like procurement always does, we scrambled and we figured out a way to keep continuity, picking up random vendors here and there to make sure that there was no service interruption. But we paid through the nose for it. It was a huge reputational, damage to my organization with some of our most important customers internally. And it was just a fiasco.
Yeah.
And the thing that really surprised me about it, Philip, was it came out of the blue. 8 months of hearing nothing, and all of a sudden, boom, a crisis on my doorstep, and I'm being told to try and solve it. And by then, it was too late to pick up the pieces and make the vendor work again. The thing that was so interesting to me about this is after the dust had settled, we did an after-action review. And I went back, and my team went back to all these prisons and hospitals and said, did this really hit us out of the blue? And they said no.
Mm-hmm.
Interestingly, a few weeks into the contract, one prison had a small problem with the vendor. The things they ordered never showed up and they got substitutes instead. And about a week later, another state hospital experienced the same problem. And then another state prison in a far-flung part of the state had a similar problem. I like to think that if I had seen all these dots, and had visibility into all these dots from the beginning, I would have seen them. I would have connected the dots. I would have brought the vendor in early, maybe in the first month, and said, hey, it looks like you're experiencing some problems. Let's figure out what we can do to get this fixed. And if we can't, let's have an orderly transition so that there's no interruption in service, and we're doing this in a really methodical way. But I never could see those dots. There was no connection for me until it was too late. And that really was the inspiration to create this product Canary that we built, because Canary lets you see those dots.
Yeah, I feel like we often because of the design of our organizations, which is led by resources and bandwidth, we will source something and then you kind of leave it to the business and you move on to the next thing. And you
100%.
leave that kind of gap of supplier management. It's not necessarily possible for you to dedicate lots of resource to do really proactive supplier management, but there's a learning there in terms of, trying to figure out under what circumstances does it make sense where you play a little bit more of a hands-on role, or can we put in a feedback loop so at least you get line of sight into things before it comes to procurement when it's already gone wrong, which happens so many times, right?
100% right. I was talking with Canary with a friend of mine who's a state chief procurement officer. And I asked him to describe his vendor performance management strategy. And he said, our VPM strategy is we say to a vendor, congrats on your new contract. We'll see you in 5 years.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's funny, but it's actually tragic.
Yeah. And what's interesting as well is, when you think about risk and risk mitigation and, leading organizations and often regulated entities are thinking about this from a inherent risk of what you're buying versus, the supplier risk and marrying the two. But when you think about food, it's not something that necessarily would jump out on the top of there's inherent risk in buying food because, there's plenty of providers out there. But
right.
I used to buy catering in automotive manufacturing. And,
Wow.
I learned the hard way that, if you try and change the makeup of a French fry for, a manufacturing plant of German auto workers, you're going to hear about it and have a rebellion on your hands, the day that they change
100%.
over. And you don't think about these things that you buy and the impact on employee satisfaction, for example, and that those are a risk, or, in delivering, from a a prison perspective, you have no food or bad food in a prison. I'm imagining that prison guards' work suddenly gets 100 times harder than what it was beforehand. And we don't necessarily connect those dots when we're buying something as well. We just think, oh, that's a commodity item,
Right.
low risk, don't need to worry about it. And those are the ones that can come and bite you.
It's funny. We in procurement, public sector and private sector, always aspire to be strategic leaders in our organization, right? I know you've talked about this a lot. We abdicate that role when all we think about is process.
Yep.
Do I have my RFPs done? Am I hitting all my KPIs to my customers? That's important. It's great. You don't want to have service interruption. But if you can't understand how procurement affects the ultimate end users in your organization, whether it's a state prison or whether it's a manufacturing facility in Germany, then you're abdicating your role. You're just a robot. And that's why procurement has a superpower, but it only exists if we can understand how we are true partners and enablers and catalysts for the people who are using our contracts to get their important jobs done.
Yeah, that it's really important to say you got to take a step back from the process, don't you? Because we're so driven by process, and oftentimes, I think that process hides, knowledge that we have around certain supply markets as well. And
100%.
That just not blindly, but just following process leads us to that tactical and transactional role. And that's where some of our perception problems come from.
And the thing is, it's actually fairly easy to go over that bridge and to go into the operations. So one thing we did, because the one thing I think I knew was I knew what I didn't know.
Yeah.
And the way that we solved it a bit was I took my leadership team one day a month to spend a day on site with one of our agencies. And I let the agencies choose where we would go. So we spent a day in the Camp Hill, Pennsylvania prison. And we really understood what are the things that are really putting pressure on the staff at the prison. Food, as you said, being one of them.
Yeah.
We had an initiative to take vehicles out of our fleet. We ended up cutting 1,000 vehicles out of our fleet in the first year, which was great. And part of it was we wanted to take SUVs out of the fleet because they're expensive and they're gas guzzlers, whatever. And so we said to our state parks department, we're targeting to take 70 SUVs out of your fleet. And so they said to me, okay, Chief Procurement Officer Yarkin, you're going to come spend the day with us at a state park. I naively said, great, love to, can't wait. They strapped me into the back of a sedan, not an SUV, and they took me up a mountain on a very unpaved and really rocky road. I got to the top of that mountain. It was a beautiful view. I almost threw up. I was extremely nauseous. And they said, are you sure you want to take away our SUVs? And it was a really effective point they made, but it helped me understand the pressure of the customer. I couldn't just say from my comfortable office, we're taking away 70 of your SUVs without actually going there and seeing the impact of that decision.
Yeah, don't make procurement just a desk job. Go 100%. Out there, and because it's easy when you're just doing process again. And it's a really important lesson. I'm sure you came up with resistance as you're starting to centralize procurement from various different agencies. That's no different from any procurement transformation where you're kind of going from a very decentralized to more of a centralized model. But how did you overcome some of that resistance?
Yeah, it's a great question. And interestingly, so before I went to work for the state, I worked for a large German company called Bertelsmann, who's one of the largest media companies in the world. They own BMG Records, Random House Books. They used to own Inc. magazine.
They did call centers as well, randomly, because I used to buy call center services from them, which is like, why am I buying call center services from a media company? But
exactly. They had a huge printing company called Arvato. They were massive.
Yep.
Right? They're massive. And when I was there, I was in the US corporate team, and we were trying to do strategic sourcing there to get all the business units to buy together in things that were common across all of them. And we met such fierce resistance, we couldn't go forward because the CEOs of Random House and BMG said, no, we're not throwing our lot in together. We're going to buy on our own because we want to control our own destiny. And it died. When I came to the state, I was really hell-bent on doing this in Pennsylvania, and I had the support of the governor. And the thing about people often say, well, you can't accomplish big things in government because it moves too slow. We did a lot more in Pennsylvania than we could do at Bertelsmann because it was much more of a top-down command and control operation, where when the chief executive officer case the governor, said we're doing it, folks could resist and say we don't want to. Ultimately, he was the decision maker. Here's a great example. So Transportation Department, which was the biggest agency in the government, I used to joke they were like their own government with their own governor. They resisted. And they said to me, what you're doing makes so much sense to centralize procurement. And you should do it for everyone else, but we need to be exempt. We're unique, right?
Yeah.
And I said, no, we need your buying power. We can't just get rid of it. And we can't also give you an exemption because what will the next department say? And they said, well, we're not going to go along with it. We're not going to be a part of it. And they sort of folded their hands. One day I got a call from the governor's chief of staff who called me and he said, I want to give you a heads up. The governor is meeting tomorrow morning, first thing, with the Secretary of Transportation. And they want to come to ask personally to the governor to get an exemption from this centralization effort. The governor wants you to be at the meeting and he wants you to get there 5 minutes before the meeting starts. So I get there, see the governor, and he said, they don't know you're coming to this meeting. When they're going to open the door and they're going to be shocked to see you're there. But I'm doing that, David, because I want them to know there are no exemptions. They have to be part of this too. So sure enough, 9 o'clock comes, the secretary and deputy secretary open the door. They walk in ready to, put a knife in me, basically. And they see me there, which was a clear sign. And they gathered themselves, they made their case. The governor asked me to make my case, and I did. And he said, look, DOT, you guys are terrific at building roads and designing roads, making sure that people can get from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh on our highways. David's department, General Services, is very good at buying things. It's their job. You guys build roads. Let David and his team buy the things you need to build those roads. And it was a very clear message, both to DOT, but to everybody else in the state, that we had his support, and that was so vital.
Did that support come from, an inherent belief from the governor that this was the right thing to do, that, that he came to that decision on his own? Or did that take influence from you or even other people around kind of the procurement space, or even his peers, where he's seeking outside counsel, who influenced him to recognize the value that centralized procurement could bring?
It was probably a combination of the two. So first, when he was campaigning for governor, he knew that he'd have a $2 billion deficit that he'd inherit. Yeah. And he had campaigned on some fairly broad goals of expanding education, things that would cost money. And he knew if he had this $2 billion deficit and new expenses that he wanted to expend to benefit the community and the population, he'd have to do a number of things that would change the status quo and drive real savings. Yeah. So he came into office already with this mindset, maybe similar to the DOGE, where he was going to come in and make big changes, even if that upset some folks. And then secondly, when I got the job, and I really quickly embraced this idea also, it was very helpful that I had a long history with him going back, 7 or 8 years. So trust, right? And that's why he invited me to that meeting with DOT. Yeah. I think those two things together were very important. And so as I think about, your audience, which I know is much more private sector procurement leaders, you need to understand what are the priorities for your CEO, right? And then you need to help them understand how procurement is a strategic partner to help them accomplish those goals, whatever they are. And then after you've started to do that, you can't stop. We, every single week, would send updates to the governor about how our work in government efficiency was supporting his broader objectives. So make that connection early, get the hook, find out what matters to the CEO, and then never let up. Every time you accomplish successes, make sure that he understands how that's driving his or her goals.
I think that's a really important point, because I speak with, some CPOs who, have the philosophy that results will speak for themselves, and others that believe in the power of continuously marketing and promoting, where others may look at them as being over promoters. I'm probably in the camp of over communicating. I would create transformation programs that were built around, the named around certain products or services that the company provided, so that there's actually a connection, to try and create a connection between what you're doing. And others would look at that as being like, immature or silly or whatever, but you're just trying to get people on board. So it sounds like from one of your successes is truly like over communicate the wins, and so that people, you're not just showing the numbers at the end of the day and people giving you a pat on the back, but you're reminding them of what you're doing.
And make the CEO part of it.
Yeah.
Like I talked about when we had Michael Dell come in for a press conference with Governor Rendell, the second we did that, it was no longer my initiative. It was his initiative.
Yeah.
Right. And the public expected and the press expected him to continue to be supporting it and leading it. So we put some of that pressure sort of back on him to do it in the same way on the private side. Make your CEO a part of your procurement reform initiatives. That way they're sort of in some ways boxed in to continuing to support it.
Yeah, and that requires getting really early involvement with them as well, doesn't it? And bring them along for the ride.
Yeah, lay out the policy, tell them what's going to happen, tell them even the things that are going to happen that are going to be road bumps, because that way when those things do inevitably happen, you've predicted it. And now you're sort of softened the potential pushback that you might be getting.
Now, based on, you talked about the great relationship you had with Governor Rendell in Pennsylvania. I'm sure that you're working with and have worked with many CPOs or procurement leaders that don't necessarily have that connection, and that there is kind of a blocker in between them and the CEO or, the head of their agency or whatever it may be. Any advice that you've got on kind of how do you operate in that environment where you may have blockers between you, or you have to do more kind of influencing, if you will, for those in power to really see the benefit of what you're trying to do?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I really do recognize I was especially fortunate to have that direct relationship. And I think most don't.
Yeah.
I would say in that case, I think it's a combination of communicating up, managing up, but also having enough results so they can speak for themselves with a little bit of help.
Yeah.
Right. So don't just tell your leadership things are great. Do great things and give them something to brag about to their leadership. Right. So if you've created a brand new contract for, vehicles, and it's saving the state or saving the company, $3 million a year, $5 million a year, don't let that news only be heard within the walls of the procurement team. Communicate that up as effectively and concisely as you can, and make your boss or your boss's boss, make them feel like it's their success, not yours.
My last question, I think, because I know we're running out of time, but we talk a lot about the importance of aligning with business needs, and yet procurement often has its own metrics, value measures. How did you look or encourage your team to balance the two? That kind of continual, insatiable need for savings that may not necessarily align with what a stakeholder within an agency may actually want or need from procurement.
Yeah, it's a good question. There's always a balance. And I think, you can't completely, forget about the important metrics and KPIs that lead to a very successful and efficient procurement operation just for the sake of satisfying the folks at the top. You need it, but you can't go in the other direction either. You have to do both. And the governor's office or the CEO really is not going to care about the fact that you processed RFPs 5% faster compared to last year. That's not going to get them votes. It's not going to increase the value of their stock.
Yeah.
So be selective. Communicate up the things that will have some resonance and relevance to the chief executive and their stakeholders who keep them in their jobs. And don't forget about the things that are vital to make your operations running more efficiently, and make sure that the metrics are helping you show to your internal stakeholders, the agencies, the operating units, that you're delivering effectively for them. I don't think you have to, give away one to do the other.
Mm-hmm. All right, David, I know it's time to wrap. So I want to thank you so much for joining me. It's been a pleasure to chat with you on the podcast. If anybody would like to reach out, connect with you, learn a little bit more about Procurated, where would the best place for them to find you?
I love LinkedIn. So find me on LinkedIn. It's just David Yarkin. I think there's only one of us. Our website is procurated.com, which is Procurated.com. procurated.com. Come see us there. But yeah, I'd love to talk with anybody who's curious about public versus private sector, and also why vendor performance management can be helpful for them in their organization.
All right. Well, what we'll do is we'll include links on our show notes page for today's episode to both your LinkedIn profile and to Procurated website. Great. Those are going to be at artofprocurement.com/podcast. That's artofprocurement.com/podcast. You'll find this conversation between me and David right there. If this episode struck a chord with you, please do send it to somebody. We grow here at Art of Procurement through word of mouth, and that would be really appreciated. You can also support us by giving us a thumbs up, a star rating, or a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. Since 2015, we've built the world's largest free resource for procurement professionals looking to elevate their impact. Our resources span podcasts like this, videos, blog posts, papers, and events. To join us on the inside and to ensure you never miss an episode, a webinar, an event, or a post, please do subscribe to our weekly newsletter, This Week in Procurement. You can do that at artofprocurement.com/subscribe. That's artofprocurement.com/subscribe. Thank you for joining us today, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.